So this is continuing with the discussion about grant writing and program evaluation and how that all ties in with research methods. And so I want to introduce this concept of logic models. This is something that was maybe mentioned very briefly in the discussion on grant writing, but I think is worth maybe laying out in a little bit more detail and give some examples of what this can look like so that people can wrap their sort of heads around what is a logic model and how much you use it and how much you develop it. So logic models are central to grant writing and program evaluation. This is sort of a visual representation of your method or your theory of change. Some people describe that as it takes an incredibly complicated world, like the world we live in, and tries to organize it down into a coherent story that you can tell. It takes the complex systems and sort of explains how they all operate together. In other words, a logic model is a theory. It's a theory about the world and a theory about how we can take what we have for resources and effectively get the kind of outcome that we want. And so as part of developing a logic model, you're going to want to identify what is the problem that you're working on, right? You're going to want to understand what are the broader factors that contribute to that in a larger world. What are the barriers that you face because of that problem or that make that problem worse? You're going to want to develop an intervention plan and figure out what are the concrete tasks that you can do that are going to counter that problem or are going to work on that problem. You want to sort of think through the story about what are going to be the consequences, maybe short-term and long-term consequences of that intervention and how it affects things. And then you want to identify what are going to be the outcomes or the objectives that you have that you're going to be able to measure. Particularly with outcomes, we're talking about things that are measurable that would help you to know, yes, I've made an effect or an impact. I've changed things because I did this process and used this intervention. And so it's sort of that story about how all of this is going to fit together and sort of puts it in a larger context. And so the textbook that we're using has an example of a logic model. It's a fairly simple and straightforward one. I'll show you one that's a little less simple and straightforward in a second here. So this is working on the problem of increasing democratic functioning, right, through voting, right? And so they identified what their problem is. They have low voter turnout, and they've also identified what they can, bring to bear on this problem. And so what they can bring to bear is that local politicians kind of would like to see more voting, but there's not a lot of budget, but they've got some volunteers, right? And so that's sort of where they're starting from. That's their inputs and their problem, their starting stage. They're going to do something, right? They're going to send out this nonpartisan reminder. It's a very simple, sort of straightforward thing. I can see how local political support and not having a large budget, but having some volunteers would allow for that to happen. We've got this short-term outcome, right? That seems fairly reasonable. You send people a reminder. It reminds them, oh, yeah, I've got to figure out how I'm going to vote or when I'm going to vote. Which gets potential voters to cast more ballots. It also helps voting become more of a habit. And so we can sort of see these intermediate outcomes happening where maybe if I'm more likely to vote in this election because I figured out sort of where my polling location is, I'm more likely to vote in the next election as well. And then we sort of have that longer term outcome of democratic functioning is enhanced, which is what we were trying to do anyway. And we can tell that story and how all these pieces fit together. And hopefully it's coherent and hopefully it's persuasive to funding agencies who might look at this and say, oh, I could see how you're going to achieve that with this plan. But this is also a fairly simple story. It doesn't have a whole lot of the broader world built into it. And so sometimes you get logic models that go a step further in terms of complexity. So this is one that sort of begins with your inputs and your outputs and your outcomes that sort of play out across the top. It's got sort of that situation arrow on the side that talks about sort of, what's the broader context that we're operating in. It lays out what are some of your assumptions that you might be bringing to the table in terms of your inputs, right? I'm assuming that my partners that I'm working with are collaborative. I'm assuming that, we've got the technical, capabilities for all of this that goes into the inputs. We talk about the outputs and the assumptions that are there as well. And you might also want to think about the external factors. So when you're thinking about the outcomes, like whether or not this this whole program, this theory of change has actually affected anything. It can be really hard to affect things if all of the headwinds of society are blowing against you, right? If your goal is to reduce child poverty, and then you have a massive recession, it doesn't really matter what your program did. The end result is that poverty probably went up because there was a massive recession, and there was nothing that you were going to be able to do to counter that, right? So those are external factors, and you might want to highlight that for grant making organizations, right? That we're doing our best, and our theory of change as we walk across this sort of thing from left to right and think about our inputs and how they affect outputs and outcomes. That's all great, but we're existing in a world, and there are a lot of factors and forces that are operating. And so tell that story, and present that to your funding organization. And then lastly, there's sort of that yellow box across the bottom that sort of lays out evaluation. And this is, again, something that we've kind of hinted at a little bit when talking about grant rating, that you're going to be asked to develop an evaluation plan. And so as you work across this process, you should be doing different tasks in terms of, figuring out who is your target that you're going to be measuring, and are you going to be collecting data, and when are you going to be reporting and interpreting that data? And all those different research tasks should be sort of laid out and available as part of your plan for your grant or your program. So these things can get really complex, and I think that's understandable. But the important piece that I want folks to sort of walk away from is that when we're talking about these logic models, this is a theory building activity, right? We are sitting in our armchair, thinking about the world, thinking about how the world works, and developing sort of a story that we can tell about how we can affect that world. It's a deductive process. And essentially, a program or a grant is a hypothesis. I think if I do these sorts of things, they will have this effect. All right, so that's, again, deductive kind of research development. And it's also an exercise in systems thinking, right? That I'm thinking not just about the relationship between these two variables, the input or the program that I'm sort of running, and the output or the outcome or the dependent variable that I'm interested in. I'm also thinking about that broader world, about how all these things fit together, about the complex systems that I'm operating in. And so I think there's a lot of sort of social science that gets woven into these things that oftentimes gets buried, but every sort of link in that graph is a social scientific activity of theorizing.